Dunk has been wearing knighthood, but he doesn't believe it yet. And episode 2 quietly proves that in under 3 seconds. And the reason most people miss it is because they're looking for spectacle instead of psychology. Everyone's watching the tournament, everyone's watching banners, armor, bloodlines, and legacy, but nobody's watching the body language, and that's where this episode lives. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's uncomfortable. And once you notice that discomfort, you realize this episode isn't asking you to cheer, it's asking you to observe, and that shift alone tells you the writers are playing a longer game. After last week's ending, we expected escalation, conflict, something recognizably Westerosi, but episode 2 does the opposite. It slows the world down. And that slowdown isn't filler, it's pressure. Because when stories remove noise, they force you to sit with characters, and that's exactly what happens here. Before any joust, before any confrontation, there's a quiet truth being planted, and it starts with Dunk's hands. Every time nobles walk past him, he subtly repositions his sword. Not dramatically, not nervously, just enough to notice. And that movement disappears completely when he's alone with Egg, which tells you everything. This isn't muscle memory, this is performance. This is a man checking whether he looks like what he claims to be. And that's not confidence, that's fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being tested, fear of being exposed. And the episode never says this out loud because it doesn't need to, the body already confessed. What makes this detail powerful is how consistently the show reinforces it through framing. Dunk is physically massive, but visually marginalized. He's often pushed to the edge of the frame, slightly off-center, especially when real authority enters the scene. Polished armor, banners, sigils, bloodlines. Suddenly, the world seems too tight for him, like it wasn't built with his proportions in mind. And that's intentional, because knighthood in this world isn't about size or strength, it's about recognition. And Dunk doesn't have witnesses. He doesn't have lineage. He has effort, and effort doesn't photograph well. Egg, on the other hand, is framed very differently. Even when he's silent, the camera treats him as someone learning something valuable. He watches conversations unfold without inserting himself. He studies who speaks, who interrupts, who is ignored. And that distinction matters, because while Dunk is learning how fragile his position is, Egg is learning how power behaves, and those lessons are not the same thing. The episode keeps returning to this contrast in small ways. Dunk reacts internally. Egg reacts strategically. Dunk absorbs discomfort. Egg catalogs it. And that difference quietly suggests that this story isn't just about whether Dunk deserves to be a knight. It's about what kind of ruler Egg might become simply by watching how authority treats honesty. There's a brutal moment buried in the middle of the episode where Dunk realizes something without speaking it. Goodness doesn't guarantee remembrance. The banners tell that story clearly. Names, colors, symbols, witnesses, everywhere. Legacy is something that requires an audience, and Dunk has none. And that realization doesn't make him angry. It makes him tired, which is far more dangerous. Anger burns out. Exhaustion settles in, and exhaustion accepts unfairness as permanent. That's why the campfire scene works so well. Nothing happens, and yet everything does. The lighting avoids warmth, faces are uneven, shadows swallow expressions, and the silence stretches just long enough to feel heavy, not dramatic heavy, but lived-in heavy, the kind that comes from understanding that tomorrow will look exactly like today and the day after that too. Dunk stares into the fire, not because he's contemplating glory, but because he's measuring endurance. And Egg watches, again, not to comfort, not to admire, but to learn how resilience looks when it isn't rewarded. That choice alone reframes Egg's entire arc, because it suggests that his education isn't moral, yet it's observational. And that's a dangerous starting point, because without guidance, observation turns into efficiency, and efficiency doesn't care about fairness. This episode keeps circling the idea of earned identity versus inherited identity. Blood opens doors, behavior earns respect, but society confuses those two constantly. And when someone like Dunk shows up, someone competent, without status, without witnesses, without armor polished to a mirror, he becomes disruptive. Not because he challenges authority directly, but because his existence raises uncomfortable questions. And you see that discomfort ripple quietly through scenes. Whenever Dunk speaks plainly, the room stiffens. Whenever he refuses to embellish or posture, someone important looks unsettled. Honesty destabilizes systems built on entitlement because it removes the performance layer and exposes how thin the foundation really is. And once people feel that instability, they don't respond with reform, they respond with control. This is where the episode becomes quietly threatening, because it suggests that Dunk's presence won't inspire better rulers, it will pressure them. And pressure without wisdom turns into violence. That's the danger of true integrity in a hierarchical system. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't flatter, it simply exists. And existence alone can be read as accusation. The episode understands this and reinforces it through sound design. Whenever we're aligned with Dunk's perspective, crowd noise dulls slightly, like tinnitus. Anxiety without dialogue. Not fear of pain, but fear of exposure. Fear of being measured and found wanting. And that fear is what separates him from the other knights who wear certainty like armor. They believe in the story surrounding them. Dunk doesn't believe the story yet, and that belief gap is everything. This is why the episode feels heavier than exciting. It's interrogating memory. Who gets remembered, who gets erased, and why? And the answer it offers is cynical. Deeds matter less than witnesses, and that truth sits uncomfortably because it suggests that goodness without visibility is functionally invisible. And once that idea settles, the episode stops feeling like a fantasy and starts feeling like a warning. It's impossible not to draw comparisons here, not in plot, but in philosophy. Seven Samurai comes to mind, not because of battles, but because of exhaustion. Honorable warriors aware that honor doesn't protect you from being forgotten. And there's also a Witcher-like morality at play. Competence without status, decency without
applause, the social cost of doing the right thing when no one is keeping score. And that's risky television because it resists wish fulfillment. But it's also what makes the episode resonate. It's not interested in making Dunk legendary yet. It's interested in making him real. And realism in this world is dangerous because real people are easy to misuse. Which brings us to the real tension simmering under everything. This episode isn't building toward triumph. It's building toward misinterpretation. Someone will misunderstand Dunk's example. Someone will act in his name without his restraint. And that's how legends get people killed. Not through cruelty, but through imitation without context. Through honor stripped of patience and applied like a weapon. Egg is watching all of this, and the unsettling part is that he might learn the wrong lesson first, that righteousness is lonely, and power is efficient, and that efficiency works even when it's wrong. The episode doesn't resolve these ideas because it shouldn't. It lets them sit heavy and unresolved because that's how they'll matter later. And by the time the episode ends, you're not energized, you're weighted down. And that feeling feels intentional because the show isn't trying to hype you, it's trying to prepare you for consequences that won't feel heroic when they arrive. And that restraint, more than any joust or crown, suggests that this story understands the cost of integrity in a world that prefers myths over men. What makes this episode stay with you long after it ends is not what happens, but what refuses to happen. There is no moment where Dunk is validated, no scene where the world pauses to acknowledge his decency, and that absence feels intentional, almost confrontational, as if the episode is daring you to sit with the same discomfort he feels, because this is not a story about recognition, it's a story about persistence, and persistence without applause is exhausting. The more time we spend with Dunk, the clearer it becomes that his journey is not toward power, it's toward endurance. Every interaction adds weight, not momentum. Every conversation leaves him slightly more aware of how provisional his place is, and that awareness is the real cost of honesty in a stratified world. There's a brief exchange where Dunk answers plainly, without irony or deference, and the reaction is telling. Not outrage, not praise, just polite distance. And that distance is sharper than hostility, because it communicates that sincerity has no social utility here. Hierarchy thrives on performance, on knowing when to bow, when to boast, when to flatter. And Dunk refuses to play that game, not out of rebellion, but out of inability. And that inability marks him as incompatible. Power doesn't hate him, it simply doesn't know what to do with him, and so it minimizes him, reframes him, sidelines him, and that quiet marginalization is more effective than open opposition, because it doesn't create martyrs, it creates fatigue.
this silently, and that silence is doing work. You can see the shift in how he watches people, not for kindness or cruelty but for leverage. Who interrupts whom, who gets the last word, who is ignored and who is indulged. This is not innocence being lost, it's innocence being reorganized into understanding, and that understanding is morally neutral. It can become compassion or calculation depending on what lessons are reinforced later. Dunk doesn't realize he's teaching these lessons, and that's part of the tragedy because his example is incomplete, without context, without authority, without protection. And examples without protection are dangerous. They invite imitation without restraint. The episode keeps layering this idea visually, Dunk framed beside symbols of permanence, banners, names, lineage, and always looking temporary, as if he could be removed from the picture without disturbing the composition. And that visual language reinforces the episode's central argument, that memory in this world is curated, not earned. And once memory is curated, truth becomes optional. This is why the episode feels restrained, almost cautious, because it knows that rushing toward spectacle would undermine its thesis. Instead, it lingers and glances, pauses, unfinished conversations, letting discomfort accumulate until it becomes impossible to ignore. This story is not asking whether Dunk deserves to be a knight, it's asking whether decency can survive without being repurposed by someone else, because decency without power is vulnerable, and power without decency is efficient, and when those two forces meet, the result is rarely justice. There's a subtle moment where Dunk hesitates before speaking, weighing honesty against consequence, and that hesitation is new. Earlier, he spoke without calculation. Now he's learning to self-edit, and that learning feels like a loss because it means the system is succeeding, not by crushing him, but by shaping him. And systems that can shape people don't need violence, they just need time. Egg sees this adaptation, and the unsettling possibility is that he may mistake it for wisdom. From a ruler's perspective, restraint looks like control, and control looks like strength, and that misreading is where future harm begins. The episode never tells you this directly. It trusts you to connect the dots, to feel the unease building under the surface, because this is a story about unintended consequences, about how good men become symbols, and symbols get used. And by the time the episode closes, you're not left with excitement, you're left with a question. What happens when integrity is visible but unsupported? And who decides what that integrity becomes once it enters the public imagination? That question is the real cliffhanger, not a duel, not a crown, but the slow realization that Dunk is not here to change the system. He's here to reveal it, and revelations rarely end cleanly. My final take on episode 2 is this. It's quiet, deliberate, and deeply uncomfortable in the best way. It prioritizes psychological tension over spectacle, and asks the audience to pay attention not to who wins, but to who is being shaped. My rating stays strong at 8.7 out of 10, not because it's flashy, but because it's confident enough to be patient. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Dunk truly believes in knighthood, or is he afraid of betraying the man who raised him? And more importantly, is Egg learning compassion, or is he learning how to perform it? Because depending on that answer, this story is either headed toward quiet heroism or inevitable tragedy. And if the show continues choosing restraint over spectacle, we may not be ready for where that path leads.